Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to do a short introduction of this session, and I think if you're here is because you all know that all the efforts to automate the issuer to investor communication channel have always been slowed down by issues on data quality and a lack of standardization. I remember when I joined Swift around 10 years ago, this was already a known problem, and yet nobody had the answer on how to solve it until today. So there is, on the few months leading to Sibos, there has been these community-led initiatives to resulted in an actual MVP, so a minimum valuable product, on a data exchange where issuers can publish the famous golden source of information for investors and custodians to access corporate actions data in a very standardized way. So I'm sure now you want to know more. The reason, on behalf of Swift, I'm introducing this session is because this initiative I just mentioned was actually part of one of Swift InnoTribe incubation projects. So it's a pleasure for me to introduce this session, and I'll leave you with Richard and his panelists. So enjoy the session, and please ask a lot of questions at the end. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. As far as questions are concerned, by the way, I gather you can ask questions through the Sibos app, and they'll come up on this iPad. So if you don't want to wait till I come to the audience, by all means, feel free to ask questions. Now, corporate actions has been, to some extent, the problem child of securities processing for a couple of decades. That doesn't mean that it isn't well done by the people in the middle, but getting end-to-end straight-through processing has been a real challenge. And while we're going to look at potential solutions to that today, we're also going to look at a little bit at the bigger issue and why there is that problem in the first place. But to provide some kind of scope for our discussion, it would be good to get an idea of the total value of corporate actions globally. What are we talking about? One way to measure it would be the actual value of the individual corporate actions all aggregated around the globe. Another, perhaps more meaningful one, would be the value lost through not efficiently processing corporate actions. Now, one individual action may not suddenly set a light off at a portfolio manager, but taken in aggregate, we're talking about a lot of money. Trillions, perhaps. I don't know if, and I'm not going to introduce the audience, but they'll each just mention who they are as they speak for the first time. Does anyone have any guess at how big the problem is? Can it be quantified? Well, James,
So we were involved in the original InnoTribe Dragonfly project, so we had to do an analysis of the market, and the quality of information was very poor and still is very poor. Having said that, there was a report published by the DTCC that put just the cost in the US at roughly $1 billion in today's money of poor processing costs. And then there's a more historical report, the Oxera report, that put the cost of poor decision making at roughly sort of $6 billion. So you're talking of an order between 5 to 8 billion, I should think, in terms of the cost of inefficiency in the industry. That doesn't take into account the value of a corporate action itself to to the custodians who make money out of looking after people's money and shares. So that's what I see as the cost.
Louise, does that chime with you? Does that sound more or less?
Yes,
right?
Yes, it does. And certainly from a global custodian perspective, if we bring this back down to, if we look at like daily volumes, daily activity, if you consider global investors are investing in over 100 markets, that typically on an average day we can see anywhere, in the 4-figure sums in terms of the number of corporate actions that are active on a given day. So it's substantial in terms of the event activity and also the interest by global investors across the global markets.
So we're looking at a huge amount of money globally in aggregate. And I don't want to suggest that there hasn't been progress in automating and standardizing this area over the past couple of decades. I mean, as long as I've been coming to Sibos, there have been discussions about SWIFT standards and ISO 15022, ISO 20022, specifically for corporate actions. Jonathan, are you still, do you want to just give us some, so we start on an upbeat note, what progress has actually been made over the past decade or so?
Well, as you know, the securities industry made a huge migration coming from the old 775 into 15022. And now the payments industry is doing the same, going for the old standard into ISO 20022. I think that's going to make the securities industry also see how the payments industry embraces ISO 20022, what are the benefits they get out of that, what are the benefits they get for more enriched data, which you're going to have in ISO 20022 for compliance reasons, for efficiency reasons. And then once that proves to be successful in the payments industry, then the securities industry might also want to move on that side. I'm not saying that the securities industry hasn't not embraced ISO 20022, they have, but it's on specific pockets. One of those pockets being ISO 20022 for corporate actions, which is maybe as outside of T2S, the place where ISO 20022 has been more widely used, whether it's in Asia or in the US. Europe has been slower into adopting ISO 20022 specifically for corporate actions.
Thanks. So, in my mind, in sort of layman's terms, the question is, why is there now not end-to-end STP in corporate actions? In my mind, and I may be wrong and you can contradict me, the problem is not so much the technology, it's people at either end. So you have the issuers who are marginally interested in standardizing and automating. You have a lot of people in the middle who are very interested, and you have the end investor, or in an institutional case, the portfolio manager, who's also not, let's just say this isn't top of the in-tray for a lot of portfolio managers. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
Yeah, I work for Equinity, so the leading registrar in the UK. Yeah, that's certainly our experience. I mean, corporate actions and dividend payments is a really big deal for us. This is a core aspect of our services. So we have it's a very intense operation, a very large part of what we do. I was introduced to James some time back on this, and James had the output of this SWIFT initiative, the Intertribe initiative. We took this to. He was introduced to me, and I looked at it. And my role in Equinity is to reach out and look for partnerships with external companies. So we took this product across over to some company secretaries. And yeah, you're right. I mean, it was pretty obvious straight away that this was not going to get traction with those guys. They have their role. They know exactly what they're doing, and their mindset is somewhat some distance away from the day-to-day issues that the market participants see. So yeah, I think a lot of it is to do with mindsets and priorities, because we live and breathe this stuff, and they have corporations to run.
So, James, if you have issuers putting out documentation about corporate actions in whatever format they want, and in order to begin to standardize and automate, there has to be some structure around this data. How do you deal with that?
So, I mean, everybody perhaps who knows about corporate actions will know that at the moment, the way that an announcement is done is you work with your agent, you announce on the RNS or whatever the equivalent is in your local country, and then that data is captured secondhand and interpreted by a local data vendor and then fed downstream to those who need it. What you need to do, and what we discovered from the Dragonfly project, because we were involved in how could you bring certainty to the corporate actions data,
Is that what the Dragonfly project
That was what the core of the project was. So we went to Swift and we said, look, we've got this digital notarization technology. It was an early forerunner of blockchain, if you like, and we think it's probably more relevant for this use case. So we went to them and they said, look, everybody in our community has a problem with corporate actions. Maybe we could use your technology to bring some certainty. So we worked with 100 of the top global corporate action specialists, and we worked through the thing in a workshop. And at the end of the workshop, what we did is we built a pilot, and we showed how you could prove the differences between announcement data coming from different sources, different data vendors. And everybody agreed, yes, you could use this notarization technology, hashing or blockchain technology, if you like, to prove the similarities or integrity of data. But every single one of the people who were involved in the project said, but that's no good if you're getting secondhand data. You need to get data from the source. Why can't we get data from the source? So clearly what you need to do is to get it from the horse's mouth. And so the project finished. Swift said, well, that's great. The industry now needs to create some form of a platform to do just that. And so we picked up that challenge, and I've been trying to enlist the support of the sources, effectively. And lo and behold, Equiniti have stepped up to the plate, and they do have that relationship with issuers. So yes, Mike's quite right. You know, when we went to speak to issuers, the company secretaries, they sort of showed lack of interest. You know, this isn't really our problem. You know, it's a market infrastructure issue. But actually, the outcome is their problem. You know, the success of their corporate action. Equiniti realized that they do have a relationship with those issuers, and I'll hand you over to Mike now, and he can explain to you, how they are going to address that problem or how they're addressing it now.
So in fact, do registrars or can registrars stand in front of the issuer as far as all the communications into the market are concerned?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we can act as an aggregator for issuers. We have a very close relationship with issuers, so we would be proactively managing an event prior to its publications. We were working hand in glove with the issuer in order to prepare for whatever corporate action is going to happen. That's handled by insider teams, so that would be ring-fenced inside Equiniti, where you have dedicated teams working confidentially with the issuer on the corporate actions coming through, or the dividend, or whatever. At the point it's made public, that data is then transferred across into another part of Equiniti, where we have the operations guys who are actually going to execute and pay that dividend, to execute that corporate action. So what I noticed was the problem that you've had in the market has always been this interpretation of the documentation that's put into the RNS, because it's often in Word format, or it's not machine readable at all. But we have that, and we have a vested interest in getting this right. We operate in that space where the data is published, and that data has to be loaded into our core systems, because those core systems are going to ultimately pay the custodian their dividend. So we have a vested interest in getting that data correct. I mean, we operate zero tolerance for errors. We have to get that right. It's absolutely core to what we offer. So it's not a huge jump to think, okay, why don't we just take this data and put this into this data exchange that we've talked about and publish that to the world? Why not?
So Louise, how does that, the setup that you've just heard about, how does that compare to what global custodians do today as a matter of practice in trying to get the correct data downstream to their clients?
Mm-hmm. So today, the custodians will receive announcement information from multiple sources, and that obviously takes time. There is semi-automation there with systems that are designed to consume that information. But there are occasions where we see inconsistencies and inaccuracy with the information that still requires manual intervention to validate the correct source. So the the utility that's been described today is really revolutionary for the custodians. We're under increasing pressure to provide notifications to the asset owners and the asset manager community quicker than ever. And this really, we see this as being an opportunity to improve the timeliness of the information that gets out to the investor community, and obviously the accuracy as well, which is critically important. Also, in terms of, we talk about global markets, and we see this, you know, in majority of the markets that we service, that there are pockets of challenges with inconsistencies in the messaging standards and how the events are being reported, you know, in those particular markets. So having a single repository to, you know, access that information securely, I think that is definitely the way forward.
Now, I see a problem, possibly out of ignorance, but to get to that single repository, so we have Equiniti, and Equiniti is a big registrar, but we're talking about the UK market amongst many global markets, and even if it's a massive percentage of the listed shares, it's not all of them. So how do you get to the point? I mean, if it's partially caters for your needs, you presumably still have to keep all the other data feeds and infrastructure that you have already, so you're increasing your costs. How do you get around that?
When Equiniti have, we registrars to 50% of the FTSE. So yes, we can bring a certain percentage to the market. Putting myself in Louise's position, I understand it. 50% it's interesting, but it's not the answer to the problem. So the way we see this is Equiniti. This isn't an Equiniti play. You know, Equiniti are unable to globally deliver data to all of the custodians. That's not going to happen. What we can do is show what can be done, show some good practice. We can agitate in our market. We have colleagues who, if we enlisted the support of two other registrars in the UK, you would get essentially 100% UK coverage. So there's a clear sort of journey that you could take to start building coverage of this idea. But it needs people to get involved. You know, you need to both get the publishers of this data, which should be the aggregators in each market, and you also need the subscribers of to this data, the custodians, because you know we can create the data and offer it to them in the format of their choice. You know, so if they're committed to 15022, you can deliver it in 15022. You know, we can have sort of future interfaces like real-time APIs, which is what we've been specializing in. We've been running in the MVP over the summer. But you know, it needs to be a community. The community needs to be engaged in this. The one company can't make all the running, so we can show we can put a use case together and show what can be done. And we've been working this summer with a global custodian to prove this in practice, to show there are tangible benefits in doing it this way. But you're dead right. We do not have the answer. It needs to be a community initiative, which is why we thought this would be a good forum to discuss it.
So would this be a case of getting 100% coverage in one market, then moving to the next market and rolling it out? And what's a logical way to progress this?
From my perspective, that's a logical way. We have 50% in the UK. We also have a presence in the US, so we could start over there. So you maybe do the UK first, and then the US with other partners. But I think Louise is probably the. You know, I always look at this as who's the customer. So they should really dictate this. So I don't know, maybe you'd like to add something. I don't want to do your job.
Yeah,
Sure.
I think the key thing here is having direct access to the source of information, and that's what we don't currently have. So the majority of our interaction will be with the registrar community or the agents acting for the issuers. However, the key part is the source of that information. So it's eliminating several steps within the current intermediary flow that allows us direct access to that verifiable source information. and you speak about the developments in the market, and DTCC is an example. They've gone through a revolutionary auto-transformation process for corporate actions, and they're now, they're retiring their aging technology and moving over to web-based, the 20022 standards. So we see that as tremendous progress and really positive and encouraging. To get us where we need to be in terms of consistency in the messaging, the format and how the data is presented to the custodians. So we then are in a strong position to then present that information back to the ultimate owners, our customer base, in an accurate and a timely manner.
And is your customer base enthusiastic about automation, or is there a job to do there to get them to engage?
Certain portfolio managers are leveraging the technology. We speak about, like, for robotics or artificial intelligence, there is a significant increase in their usage of technology because they are under similar, constraints in terms of their own internal operations, optimization, and looking at, cost reduction measures associated with streamlining their processes. So I think there's probably a way to go, but I see there are certainly large asset managers who are fully embracing the technology.
And is there any incentive that can be given to the issuers to present their data in a more structured way, or do we just have to live with they'll do what they have to do and it's your job to standardize it?
I think the concept of having aggregators of data is probably quite useful. Otherwise, you have an awful lot of entry points into the system. So I think there's some benefits in scale in doing it that way. You then have, and you've got people with the expertise to do that because they repeated that. There's a repeatable role for them. Then they maybe do X hundred times per annum, whereas an issuer it would be twice a year for his dividends.
Right. Now, you've mentioned, Louise mentioned the DTCC. Is there a role for market infrastructures in just mandating or being stricter about the way they want the companies listed on the exchanges that they service to report to them? That would seem like a logical thing to me.
So, yes, and there are market infrastructures already mandating the way that issuers publish their information. The Singapore Exchange is one. ASX has partially moved in that direction. Mike mentioned there's a role for aggregators. We don't see issuers doing this unless they have help. So we see their agents being the sort of access points to get this done. So the registrar agents, CSDs, ICSDs, they're the sort of touch points who could make this happen really quickly. They just need to engage, and exchanges obviously as well. So, I'd hold up the Singapore Exchange as an absolute model here. They've done a great job. So yeah.
Are you working? Have you worked directly?
Yeah. We're working with the Singapore Exchange, and they've we've got their data coming in. We can show how structured ISO 20022 can come in. They're not using the digital notarization technology yet, so that data couldn't be re-authenticated as it flows on down the stream. So, that's a piece of work to be done. But we need the custodians to tell us or tell them that, this is necessary, and then we can bring that to bear.
So could you just, I know what a registrar does, and I know what a global custodian does. Can you just, for the audience, give us a rough guide to where
I fit in?
Where you fit in.
Okay,
why are you here?
I'm not sure, really. So the whole point about data is if you pass it to the first person in the chain, you've got a direct relationship between the source and the consumer of that data. But by its very nature, corporate actions data flows onwards and down through the channel all the way down to the end investor. So the end investor can't tell whether that data came from the source. And that's what we did when we first engaged with Swift. We said, look, we could come up with a model that shows how you could take a capsule of structured ISO 20022 or 15022, give it a digital fingerprint, and then that can pass with the data, or it can be put in a separate registry. We call it codon marking. So there's a CODAL registry of these digital fingerprints. And then the authors of the data can expire those digital fingerprints and use that as a verification method to point to verifying parties to more up-to-date information. So for example, if there's a follow-on announcement that has a currency rate, for example, when somebody downstream does a verification of this data, ISO 15022 or 20022 message, it does a API lookup, and that's another role that Swift can play there. So it does this API lookup and a call to CODAL, and CODAL says, no, the author says there's a follow-on announcement, go here and collect that more recent information. So that's partly the role we play. The other part was this sort of unifying aggregation role, the sort of the platform providing the structured templates that people need. So Louise will tell you there are variously 72 or 74 different types of corporate action, depending on which part of the world you live in. Swift does a great job at providing the special market practice groups that define what those are in the local areas, and the event interpretation grid, but it's incredibly complicated. So if you could bring that back to a central access point, provide templates that allow people to give you structured data, that it can then be STP'd, which is where you started at the beginning of this whole discussion. You capture data in a source-accurate form right at the beginning. You can digitally notarize that, and then people can refer to the accurate information as it flows, and they can add to it. So a custodian, for example, could add servicer data. They can republish that data, give it a second CODAL digital notarization mark, and that can pass with the data as it goes on downstream. And people right at the end can see that this hasn't changed. And not only that, we keep an audit trail of all verification events, which means that the issuer can know that their investor has received the information all the way downstream, which satisfies a piece of regulation, which I know you're going to come on and talk about in a minute.
At this point, are there any questions from what you've heard? Otherwise, I'll come back to you. So I'd now like to look at the question of liability in this context. At the moment, there are established, I guess, notions of who is liable for the accuracy of data on down through this rather complex chain. Does that change at all in the kind of environment that you're talking about? I mean, how do you...
Do you want me to take that? So,
Yeah.
So when we started doing our job as Instant Actions, the sort of aggregating platform, we went and talked to some of the custodians. Louise will be pleased that State Street wasn't one of them. So we found it difficult to get traction because one of the questions was, well, what about liability? How, who's going to take liability for this data? The truth is that the issuer is already liable for the data and the accuracy of that data. It's accountability that they're really looking for, because if you try and put the liability of problems on the issuer, for market movements in their shares, if there's an error, it's just never going to, you're going to put a barrier up at the very beginning of getting this done. So what you want is a platform and a mechanism for them to correct mistakes when they happen and be satisfied that people can rely on those corrections and know that they're going to pick those up downstream, hence the digital notarization technology. But I'll hand over to Mike, because I know he's put a lot of thought into liability from an Equiniti perspective. Haven't you?
Mike?
I thought you had.
Yeah, so I think the key thing here is this whole project is all about reducing risk. So by having a transparent end-to-end workflow where it's fully auditable, you can see exactly what's going on, you're essentially reducing risk. So yeah, there's always this concept about what happens when it all goes wrong, but the way to look at this is you're actually reducing the chances of things going wrong. This is why it's a good thing. The more people, bringing these people in and applying their skill sets and applying their data directly into this is actually reducing risk for everybody.
Yeah,
So
that's
a good outcome.
So the scale of the risk will reduce as you get accurate data. That's the idea.
James mentioned the Securities Market Practice Group, I think. Louise, you're involved in that? Or?
Yes, State Street.
So
yes.
within that environment, have you identified any particular areas for the community to address as a whole, rather than for each individual bank?
So the key area for the discussion is around the data exchange utility and how we can eliminate some of those stages that currently exist in the data scrubbing, the data processing, really to increase the straight-through processing and really using the golden source record as the starting point, which it is in the life cycle of the corporate action, and working from that point. So when you know that you have secure, accurate information at the starting point of the process, then that will help, through each of the remaining stages that happen in the natural life cycle of the corporate event through to the payment of the entitlement.
And is there an Equiniti equivalent in all situations to help with to facilitate the correct sourcing of data? Or are you, what do you do when there isn't an Equiniti?
That's a good question, because I think what's happening now is forums like this are starting to bring the intermediaries together, because we cannot do it in isolation. So we need this partnership to drive forward the changes that we're describing, else it's just not going to come to fruition.
So so far you've come up with something which I think Jonathan mentioned at the beginning, MVP, minimum viable product. Mm-hmm. What is that in practical terms in this context?
Okay, so what we've been doing over the summer is we took James's software, loaded it up onto some Equiniti hosting services, and I've got my development team put together some real-time APIs so that we could pull data directly out of our core systems, essentially machine to machine, so with no human intervention. So the idea being, if we're going to go for golden source data, then we need to make sure that we don't have any people in the way of this. It's all machine to machine. We've been delivering this data in the format of choice to a global custodian. In this case, we were using 15022, and ran through. We were focusing essentially on dividends for this first part, but it's the same argument for everything else. And the findings are good. I mean, they made the statement that we had 100% accurate data, which was obviously what the object of the exercise was. There's some interesting things have come out in that you start to see how businesses are organised, and they're organised about what their actual role is in the process. So, being a registrar, I'm not au fait with Swift tags, I'm afraid, but I'm sure someone will help me in a minute. But there is a Swift tag which gives the stock exchange in the UK, the stock exchange.
COAF.
Well, what's it called?
The COAF.
COAF, yes.
The Corporate Action Event Identity.
Sadly, I didn't know that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we don't have access to that data. So there's some things that are falling out as you try to do this when we have 100% other data, and so you then start to look at, clearly there needs to be some interaction between a number of people, but yeah, the tests have gone well, and what's quite interesting, we had a conversation earlier. This dialogue between the two ends of the workflow is actually going on informally all the time. State Street and Equiniti are constantly speaking to each other on the phone about issues, but it's all done informally, and it's all done on an as-needed basis. And so we're just taking what's sort of human nature, really. I mean, if State Street have an issue with one of our corporate actions, the obvious thing to do is to pick up the phone and speak to us. But what we're looking at doing here is just putting some shape to that, just regulating that, and providing it in a deliverable way, or a reliably deliverable way.
Now, I know it's early days, but how much interest have you seen from any of your peers in this new process? So whether it's registrars, whether it's custodians, whether it's...
So, sorry.
Well, I think there's significant interest from the custodian community, and I think that's been demonstrated through the participation in the Dragonfly project, because we all have the same common goal and interest. And it's about pulling together our resources and our experiences and being able to influence that change and what we would like that to be in terms of, you know, the automation, you know, how that information is presented to us in a electronic, you know, streamlined way. And I think there is an appetite out there from my own experiences to really drive this forward.
Is there anything that regulation can do to help drive it forward, or is that an unknown at this point?
Well,
And James, do you want to?
I mean, I'm not a regulation. Louise will know the regulations better than me, but I mean, obviously, one is the Shareholders' Rights Directive, which
so around this time in September next year, we need to be fully compliant with the directive. So how that impacts on corporate actions, there is now an obligation for the intermediaries to provide information timely. So essentially, any information that we receive by 4 o'clock, it needs to be turned around that same day and sent on to the investors. So that in itself will present a number of challenges in that we need to be able to comply with these directives. So, you know, there is a lot of work that's being done in the industry because we need to meet these timeframes. But if we look further afield, you know, the utility is really a mechanism for us in the longer term to be able to satisfy those obligations in a, you know, in an efficient, effective way.
I mean, from a regulation perspective, that was our objective, was to have something ready in time so that when custodians need to comply, or first intermediary needs to comply, or issuers need to comply, there'd be a platform there ready for them to push their structured data. So the regulation, I think, says issuers have to give a small amount of structured data. It's not very detailed or comprehensive. I know that the AFME working group and Mike Collier, who's not here today, who would like to have been here, they're lobbying the EU to improve the amount of structured data you get from the issuer. So regulation is supporting this, and so we're quite excited about that.
Is the Dragonfly project still ongoing, or was that the first stage?
So
it's a nice name.
Yeah, well, maybe we'll bring it back. Jonathan, you need to decide. After the sort of after it finished, after the Sibos thing some time ago, we renamed it Instant Actions. It had more relationship to the corporate actions sort of solution that we were trying to provide, but you know, we're not wedded to it. And really, what we're looking for are custodians to participate and sources to participate. They can choose.
So if somebody listening to this thinks that's interesting, I want to get on board before I'm forced by some pressures, how do they do it? Is it closed?
No, it's open. It's an open. I'm here, so you can come and talk to me. There's a participate link up on our website. There's a white paper which you can download, which tells you about the problem, what the scale of the problem is. Really, we're looking for sources and consumers. So on the one hand, we're looking for registrars, CSDs, and exchanges to want to help get their issuers' data in accurate form downstream. There's an incentive for them to do that. And then downstream, we know that the cost to the custodians and the risk is high and that they want to solve that problem. So they will pay a small fee when they consume the data. Theoretically, it should be a lot lower than what they're paying data vendors for now. And that will come in the form of some form of Swift engagement, we hope. Swift has got an API strategy, which, Jonathan, I don't know if you want to just briefly mention how they might be able to consume the data going forward.
Yeah, I think the simplest way to describe it is that API that could be consumed via the Swift network is ISO 20022. The data that you are sharing in your platform is ISO 20022. And if within that platform there's any other technology that you want to apply in the future, like any blockchain technology, if those smart contracts are also ISO 20022, then the communication is the same. So you can communicate outside of that exchange using 15022 or 20022, or you can consume in a pool mode with an API that is also ISO 20022.
Yeah. So just sort of finish that. The people who engage first will be able to influence their problems, what they want Instant Actions to, or Dragonfly, to address first. So if you've got a particular problem in a particular marketplace or a particular type of corporate action, you'll be able to make that happen first. And we're looking for sort of anchor consumers and investor partners. So,
Right.
yeah.
So, last chance for questions. Dominic, there's a mic coming. I think.
Michael, you said that there was a need for a community of data vendors to support the idea of a data repository, data exchange. What incentive do data vendors who are making a very nice living out of selling this inaccurate data to custodians, which then have to manually intervene to fix it, to change their methodology? They're getting paid to do this now. Why would they change? What's the incentive they have to behave differently?
So it was-
Data vendors, what incentive do they have to adopt, because they're making money at the moment out of this inaccurate data chain.
Yep.
What incentive do they have to join this new?
Well, I think what you want people who've got golden source data. So if a data vendor is I don't know if that rules data vendors out. I'm not sure. I mean, the way it was originally envisaged, we were looking to bring people who are not traditionally data vendors. Equinity is not a data vendor. Equinity has a relationship and responsibilities to the issuers, our customers. And all we're trying to do here is just improve the experience for our customers. So if we, by taking that data and being responsible in dealing with the market, improving the lot for our customer base, then everybody gains. Whether a data vendor, I mean, as far as the data vendor is concerned, I said the data vendors, are they just the pipe between these things? I mean, I'm not quite sure where the data vendors would sit in here. So you're really looking for people who've got the pure data and who are not necessarily in the transcribing somebody else's data.
Well, Louise, you presumably are a client of numerous data vendors. Do you see your relationship with them changing in this new environment?
In the short term, I would say no, because if you were looking to do any change, I don't think it would be, I think you would still want to have a relationship with your data vendors so that you still have a level of comfort in the initial stages before you fully embrace moving to a single source. But I think that's just a question for the future. I mean, it's quite a question mark over that just now.
But you should welcome anyone who can add to it. So if anyone can bring something to the table, then they should be welcomed.
So
yeah, the data vendors, they do provide a valuable service at the moment, and they're the trigger. They provide that trigger announcement that the custodians use at the moment. And this is going to disintermediate. It's going to be disruptive, but it's going to be over time. And data vendors do things as well as corporate actions. They don't just do corporate actions. So I would argue it's probably quite a small percentage of their business at the moment. So I'd like to think that data vendors would get on board. And they spend a lot of money collecting this stuff at the moment. They got gangs of people doing it. So we could potentially help them get that in a structured, source-accurate form.
right, so we're almost out of time. I'd just like to ask each of you if you can tell me in sort of 10 to 15 seconds what you see as the next milestone, what you would like to see as the next milestone in this project. And we'll start with James.
Okay, difficult one. Well, I know, for me, I know exactly what it is. It's a couple of custodian anchor tenants to help us craft the infrastructure and some more sources. So we want to continue with Equinity, and I'm hopeful we'll do that. We'd like their counterparts on a market-by-market basis, and we'd like a couple of CSDs. So.
Great. And Louise?
I think it's expanding on these partnerships that we've began to develop with the others, and just continue with that in terms of advocating on behalf of the custodian community as well as our investors, in terms of shaping the future on how we would like that data information to be presented to us, really to drive things forward.
And I think from our perspective, it's really seeing if there's an appetite for this. You know, if the custodians see some value in this and wish to get involved, then I'm sure on our side, the aggregators of the issuers would see an advantage and would also wish to get involved. So it's really, you know, as I said, this is a catalyst. We just need to see what the appetite is in the market.
Okay, thank you very much. If anyone wants to speak to any of the panelists, I'm sure they'd be happy to have a chat afterwards. And
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.